The UFC has spent decades turning itself from a group of sports outlaws into a multi-billion-dollar business. The Middleweight Championship was started by the company in 2001. The first champion, Dave Menne, beat Gil Castillo to win the title. Up until 2001, the Light Heavyweight Championship was called the UFC Middleweight Championship. The middleweight title has been one of the most important parts of the promotion since 2001. Some of the biggest names in the history of the promotion have held this title. Today, we rank all of the 185-pound champions. Even though he won it first, that doesn't mean he's the best. Dave Menne may be one of the most forgettable UFC champions in history. He was a professional athlete for 15 years, but this moment of glory inside the UFC cage will be his greatest moment. When Menne fought Gil Castillo at UFC 33, he had already been in the ring 40 times. Castillo had only had 8 MMA fights up to that point and was still unbeaten. But the experience was too much, and Menne won by a unanimous decision to become the first champion. Menne's first time at the top would not last long, as he would lose the title to the Brazilian Mario Bustamante in his first attempt to defend it. He never came close to challenging for the title he started, and he retired in 2012 after losing to Bustamante again. Evan Tanner, who has since passed away, was the third middleweight champion in UFC history. He beat David Terrell at UFC 51 to win the empty title. Tanner had just won 3 times against Vil Baroni and once against Robbie Lawler, who would become the welterweight champion when he challenged Terrell for the title. Tanner went into the fight with a record of 30-4. He left with another win and the UFC title, which had been open for 3 years. He would lose his first title defense, which was against Rich Franklin, when the doctor stopped the fight in the 4th round. Luke Rockhold should have been a strong UFC champion when he beat Chris Weidman to win the middleweight title at UFC 194. It looked like he was on the right track. At the time, Weidman was a champion who had never lost, but Rockhold's win didn't change anything. He would lose his title when he tried to defend it for the first time. Michael Bisping would knock him out and win the title in one of the biggest upsets by an underdog. Since he lost the title, Rockhold has only fought 3 times. His last fight against light heavyweight champion Jan Blachowicz at 205 was a loss. George St. Pierre is better than Tanner and Rockhold because he has never lost his title. After a 4-year break, the legend of welterweight moved up to a heavier weight class and fought for the Fairy Tale title against Michael Bisping at UFC 217. GSP would win the title if he choked out Bisping in the 3rd round, making it 13 straight wins for him. That was also Rush's last fight in the octagon. He would give up the title and retire after that. Since we never saw him defend his title, we can't put him ahead of the fighters who have at least one defense to their name. Murilo Bustamante was a Brazilian jiu-jitsu whiz and a high-profile attraction when he joined the UFC in 2000. He took the UFC title from Dave Menne via 2nd round TKO to become the 2nd man to ever hold the title. Bustamante would be the first champion to successfully defend his title. At UFC 37, he beat Matt Lindland by getting him to submit twice in the same fight. He would leave the promotion after this win, and the title was vacated for 3 years until Evan Tanner won the title in 2005. Michael Bisping became the first UFC champion who was born in Britain when he beat Luke Rockhold by knockout despite being a plus 800 underdog. Bisping's victory is one of the best moments in the history of sports. Bisping had been in the UFC for 20 fights at the time and he had never won a title. However, he stepped in at the last minute and beat the favorite Rockhold, making for an unforgettable MMA moment. Bisping would defend his title against Dan Henderson in a rematch of their UFC 100 fight, but he would lose to a returning George St. Pierre in 2017. Bisping would stop fighting after his next fight, which Kevin Gastelum won. His story is more well known than this time as King. Robert Whittaker has never been able to successfully defend the middleweight title, but he does have one defense that didn't count because his opponent was 0.2 pounds over the weight limit of 185 pounds. Whittaker beat Yoel Romero at UFC 213 in 2017 to become the interim UFC middleweight champion. After GSP retired, he was given the undisputed title. At UFC 225, he defended his title against Romero, who weighed in at 185.2 pounds. This was one of the best middleweight title fights the company has ever seen. He lost his belt to Israel Adesanya in 2019, but he will soon get another chance to fight the current champion. One of the most underrated fighters in UFC history, Rich Franklin was a middleweight standout in the mid-2000s. At UFC 53, he took the title from Evan Tanner. At UFC 56 and 58, he beat Nate Quarry and David Lassau to successfully defend the title. Franklin would become the first victim of Anderson Silva's legendary title run when Silva took the belt from him at UFC 64. Franklin stayed competitive and tried again to win the title at UFC 77, but he couldn't end Silva's reign, so he never got back to that spot. Still, he's our boy. Chris Weidman's rise in the UFC was amazing. The former All-American wrestler was supposed to be just another placeholder to challenge Anderson Silva at UFC 162, but Weidman stunned the world and knocked out a complacent Silva to end one of the most legendary title reigns in the sport's history. Weidman would rack up 3 defenses. At UFC 168, he broke Anderson Silva's leg in a brutal fight that gave him his first title defense. At UFC 175, he beat Lyoto Machida with a unanimous decision. And at UFC 187, he knocked out Vitor Belfort in the first round. Luke Rockhold would take the title away from him, but Weidman's upset of the status quo is still one of the most famous moments in the history of the sport. The current middleweight champion has already become the second best fighter to hold his title, which is a place he may have to stay for a long time. Adesanya is still undefeated in the division and took the title from Robert Whittaker at UFC 243 with a sensational second round KO. Since then, Adesanya has defended his title 3 times against divisional bad guy Yoel Romero, unbeaten Brazilian Paulo Costa, and Marvin Vettori, who he had already fought. At UFC 248, Romero lost by a unanimous decision, and at UFC 253, Costa was knocked out in the second round. And at UFC 263, Vettori lost by a one-sided decision. The legend of Adesanya keeps growing, and he is currently undefeated in his division. Anderson Silva, who is known as the Spider, is by far the best middleweight fighter of all time. Silva holds the record for the longest UFC title reign. He held the title for almost 7 years, which is longer than anyone else. During his run, Silva defended the title against 10 men. This is the second most consecutive title defense in UFC history. Silva is one of the most mysterious strikers ever to play a sport. We haven't seen many other fighters have as much power over their division as he does. Silva's beat everyone until Chris Weidman, when his pride turned out to be his worst enemy. Silva's career didn't end well after he lost his title. He went 1-6-1 and had a bad end to his career. Still, he is one of the best fighters of all time and the best middleweight champion in UFC history. That's all for today.